verse, this is not one of my favorite texts. As a general rule of thumb, whenever you have a text that ends weeping and gnashing of teeth, it's not one of my favorite texts. I always find it a little ironic, too, when a text ends, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, and then you said, good news of the Lord. It's like, kind of missed that good news there somewhere. This particular text has bothered me probably as long as I've known about the text. Somehow it just doesn't sound like Jesus. And I've puzzled over that. Jesus, what did you have in mind with this text? Why is it there? Maybe somebody snuck it into the Bible and it isn't supposed to be there somehow. But there it is. And I've got to deal with it. And over the years, I think I've developed a variety of ways of dealing with it. And I think I've come closer to what makes sense to me. And this morning, I finally read something this past week that finally, I think, made it make sense to me. Whether it makes sense to you, who knows? But hang in there with me. Too often, I think it's easy to look at this text and say, aha! Jesus was American. He was a capitalist. He understood. People who deserve more get more. They make more. The people who don't deserve lose what's theirs. That's the way it's supposed to be. I have students tell me that people are only as wealthy as they want to be. And if they don't want to be wealthy, they aren't. And if they're poor, it's because they don't want to be wealthy. And I'm like, wow, isn't that something? I have a friend of mine who's a career counselor, and on the test that he used to give them a number of years ago, it always just asked them what different things they wanted, and all of them said they wanted high incomes and a lot of leisure. In other words, everybody, when it came out the end, they're going to be doctors and lawyers, okay? I'm sorry, that's just not going to work for everybody. But yet everybody, I think, actually does kind of want to be wealthy. I'm sorry, it doesn't work to say that just those are wealthy who want to be. It doesn't quite work that way. But our society, this is kind of how we think about things. And it does seem to be how things are working, right? The rich folks are getting richer. The poor folks are getting poorer. At least the gap is growing. That's what the data says. Wow. Jesus told it the way it was, the way it is. That's the way life is. Maybe that's the way it's supposed to be even. Because this master praises his servants for doing this. That's the way it is. But does that sound like Jesus? Jesus, who said, the last shall be first? Who said, blessed are you who are poor? Who praised the widow who gave a penny or whatever, just a little mite as compared to the rich folks? Who was always so critical of those who are standing in the public square making a big show of themselves? Does this sound like Jesus? Not to me. Well, sometimes we pretty this text up a little bit. And it's made easier by the words that are used. The text itself talks about talents. Well, of course it's not about money. It's not about having wealth. It's about our gifts. Those who have a lot of gifts should be using those gifts. And if you don't have so many gifts, well, you still ought to be using it. You don't want to hide your light under a bushel. And I actually do think that's true. But I don't think that's what this text is about. But if I were to take that theme, the best thing I can actually do with this text is a little different than what it first sounds like. Because if you think about it, does it sound any better to say, okay, you with a lot of gifts, you're going to use your gifts and you're going to have even more gifts. You're going to do such wonderful things. And those of you who don't have so much gifts, you're going to do wonderful things too. And if you don't have too many gifts, you're going to bury them in the backyard and then you're going to wind up throwing in the dark. That doesn't really sound any better than the money thing, does it? The only thing I can do in that line is to think about it and say, this master was a scary guy. Right? He was harsh. Not a friendly guy to work for. I'd hide my money in the backyard too. But God is not like that. God is the very opposite of that. And so part of this text, I think, actually is to encourage us not to be afraid. I don't think that's the heart of it in this term, but I think this text in the Bible elsewhere tries to help us say, I'm not afraid. Don't have anything to prove to anybody. No reason to be afraid of it. But I actually think I started getting a little closer to what I think the meaning of this text is when I heard about a man who was doing a Bible study with guys who were homeless, and they were studying this text. At one point, one of the guys said, The guy who buried the money in the backyard, he's the only one who got out. He's the only one who didn't have to work for this mean master anymore. He got out. Everybody else was stuck in this system, working for this guy who was harsh. He got where he didn't read, just not a good guy. They're all still working for him. This guy got out. Although I had to say he got out into weeping and gnashing of teeth, and that still doesn't sound so good, so I'm sort of like, still a little puzzled. But I read something this week that finally connected for me. And I think to connect, part of what you have to understand is what money values are involved. I don't know about you, but I have no idea what a talent is. So I read this text as sort of like, the master gave one guy 5 apples, he gave another guy 2 apples, he gave another guy 1 apple. The one came back with 10, the other one came back with 4, and the third one just brought him back his apple. Okay. Well, what do you do with that? But I'd like for a moment for you to think about this text in terms of being someone like the guys I worked with in the summers when I was in college. I used to work for a mining company. And the guys there were a little bit cynical sometimes about their bosses. And so if you got to be working too hard, they would tell you things like, what are you working so hard for? The only rewards they give around here are leather awards. A kick in the pants or a belt in the mouth. Not exactly the most positive about their supervisors and the bosses in the company. And let's say they made about $35,000 a year. Let's say that was about the average income. It wasn't there, but it wasn't then, but it might be now. Let me read the text with that sum in mind. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave $3.5 million. To another he gave $1.4 million. To another he gave $700,000, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the $3.5 million went off at once and traded with them and made $3.5 more million. In the same way, the one who had the $1.4 million made $1.4 more million. But the one who had received the $700,000 went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. After a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the $3.5 million came forward, bringing $3.5 more million, saying, Master, you handed over to me $3.5 million. See, I've made $3.5 more million. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the $1.4 million also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me $1.4 million. See, I've made $1.4 million for you. His master said to him, Well done, good and trustworthy servant. You've been trustworthy in a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. Then the one who had received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid and went and hid your $700,000 in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master replied, You wicked and lazy slave. You knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the $700,000 from him and give it to the one with $7 billion. For all those who have, more will be given, and they will have abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Well, I think the guys I worked with said, yeah, he would have had to get a job. He would have actually had to work for a living now. $700,000, now he doesn't have anything. Well, you have to work like the rest of us do. And think about it. I'm going to give you $3.5 million. I put you over a few things. Yeah, really? One of the things about Jesus' day, as I understand it, is they tended to think of wealth as kind of a fixed commodity. So if somebody got more, that meant somebody else necessarily got less. So this guy was not just wealthy, but he was taking wealth from other people. Also, it was illegal to put your money in a bank and earn interest. That wasn't allowed in the Jewish law. So not only was this guy well off, but he was doing and recommending things that were not considered proper in that society. The guy who got basically kicked off into weeping and gnashing of teeth was essentially the one who followed Jesus. You see, Christianity is for the people who wind up weeping and gnashing their teeth, and those who identify with them. After all, in our society, who wants to be poor? Would you all rather have $3.5 million, and if you once had $700,000 and now you had nothing, would you be weeping and gnashing your teeth? And wouldn't everybody else be looking at you saying, what an idiot, he had $700,000, now he's got nothing. You would have been thrown into the outer darkness. You wouldn't be able to go to your country club anymore, you wouldn't have your nice house, you would be in a lousy place in our society. What worse could happen to somebody in our society than to become poor? Please, I'm not speaking truth here, but I'm talking in terms of how our society thinks. Particularly now. Our society seems to be in the mode of, we need to protect people like this so that things will be better for the people weeping and gnashing their teeth. Let me go back to the mining fellows I used to work with. If you go to northern Minnesota, you'll find that there are two towns in many places, right next to each other. Both were mining towns. One was for management, one was for labor. If you fell out of management and wound up in labor, weeping and gnashing your teeth. One town for those who wept and gnashed their teeth, the other ones for the people who had stuff. Jesus offers a different way. Right after this text, Jesus talks about the judgment of God. There are people who come before Jesus the last day and they say, Jesus says, welcome, you're divided into sheep and goats. Sheep go over here, goats go over there, and the ones going to be goats said, what's wrong, Jesus? Why are you sitting over there? And he said, well, you didn't feed me when I was hungry. You didn't give me something to drink when I was needing a drink. You didn't visit me in prison. And those who came and wind up on the other side, why are you here? Well, because you fed me when I was hungry, you gave me some drink when I was thirsty. In other words, you identified with those who were weeping and gnashing their teeth. That's who Jesus came for. Those who were thrown out of the system, those who did not fit, those who were not part of what the people of the world said was respectable. Those who are on the margins, that's who Jesus came for. This is a scary time. As far as people who are looking for jobs, really hard. Really hard. It's hard to know what's ahead of us. In the midst of this, Jesus, I think, says, to not be afraid, for I am with you. Often, I think I've said this before, when I didn't have a job for a while, I figured I must have screwed up after a while. I must have done something wrong. And I think oftentimes people who don't have resources, who don't have jobs, feel like maybe I did something wrong. And they may not be at all. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it whatsoever. In fact, often it doesn't. And this text says to those of us who feel vulnerable, those of us who are afraid, no, I am with you. I love you. And let's love one another. If there's one thing the church needs to figure out how to do right now, it seems to me, is figuring out how do we love one another in hard times? How do we care for one another in hard times? How do we not withdraw into ourselves and become self-protective in hard times? How do we be what Jesus called us to be? A community of people in the midst of fear of gnashing and weeping. Jesus calls us to not be afraid, to trust, and to know that God is there wherever we find ourselves. In life or in death, in plenty or in want, God is there. And we are always called to identify with those who struggle. Because we have a God who identifies with us.